So I've teased this for a while now, actually, and we were finally here. Several months ago now, I guess, it was the choir were getting ready out in the narthex and into the conference room, and I overheard Lucan talking, and Lucan said, "Don't ever let a song sing you." In that moment that he said that, I was reminded of how brilliant he was, and I was also reminded that the best preachers steal really good ideas. And since he's here, I have to give him credit for it. And so for several months now, I've kind of been ruminating on what that meant and what that says to us. And this week, Stephen has designed a beautiful cover for us with a musical note. And in the background, you see that kind of digital kind of expression of music, which probably says a little something about music as well. And so over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to explore what it means to say, "Don't let a song sing you." Now, in modern times, the most often referred to phenomenon when it comes to music is American Idol. And our own Atlanta's own Ryan Seacrest went to Dunwoody High School, has been the host of that show since the beginning. There was another guy that was with him. I can't remember his name, but he went away pretty quickly, and Ryan Seacrest became the host of that show. And then you had Simon Cowell, Paula Abdul, and Randy Jackson, who were the original Idol judges. And there were so many sayings that came out and became almost cliche. But one of the things that the judges would say, obviously with American Idol, what most of the contestants are doing, particularly in early rounds, is they're singing other people's songs. And they will sing those songs and to the best of their ability. In the very early rounds, it's for the ability to go to Hollywood to compete. And then as judging begins and as the votes begin to be tallied, it's about getting on to the next round and not being eliminated. But one of the things that the Idol judges would often say when someone sang a song was, "You made that your own." Randy Jackson might say, "Yo, dog, you made that your own." All the original judges are gone. Ryan Seacrest is still there, the busiest man in Hollywood. But that phrase lives on. You made that your own. For those of us who love music, a contestant would get up and they would say, "Well, what are you going to sing for us?" And young women would often want to sing something by Whitney Houston or Mariah Carey. And I think we'd all kind of cringe a little bit, right? Because we know what kind of pipes it takes to sing Mariah or Whitney. And you're just hoping that they can pull off what they plan to do. And young men would get up and try to sing Michael Jackson or some other very difficult voice to mimic. But the purpose of American Idol has always been so that those young men and women find their own voice, are able to sing their own songs. And so this morning we're going to start in Paul's letter to the Romans, Romans 12, beginning with the first few verses. Romans 12, beginning in verse 1. "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as holy and living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." This is the word of God for the people of God. Will you pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Think with me for a few minutes this morning. Do not be conformed. We live as we have said for really the entire 4.5 years we've been together, but in recent months it seems increasingly clear that we live in a difficult world. There are challenges really on every front. It's a challenging world in which we live. And there's a tendency when we face challenges to maybe reach to the lowest common denominator, to become just like everyone else. And most of the time, that's pretty destructive, because most of the time that leads to kind of monolithic thinking that doesn't allow for one to truly celebrate who they are, what they should be doing. As Paul writes in the 12th chapter of Romans, as he's preaching and teaching and writing, and obviously in this case to the church in Rome, he's alluding to the Old Testament practice of bringing sacrifices to the altar. People would bring their very best to the altar, and that would be sacrificed before God. We learned that the sacrifices had to be perceived as perfect in human terms, and they would be presented and burned. And Paul's trying to make clear that we are to present ourselves as living sacrifices, that there's no need necessarily to physically die, but we need to be able to die to our old selves, to live fully into it, who it is that God is calling us to be. Holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Thinking about worship like this is important, and we will continue this theme as I've read some other just powerful things about worship and song and singing. So I asked the children, and they didn't give me a lot of answers, but I'm going to do this by show of hands because it'll be easier than shouting out. So how many of you love country music? I love country music. Absolutely. Carrie Underwood's new song, There's Something in the Water. Anybody heard that? Good. Ooh, we're going to sing that in church one Sunday. We're working on that one. Ariel and I are working on that one. Love country music. Now, in the midst of the 80s, when all I listened to was hair bands, my best friend Rick and I made a pledge that if either of us started listening to country music, we would take the other one out. Problem was, we started listening to country music about the same time and loving it. And obviously, I shared after Shannon and I had the opportunity to go to the Garth Brooks concert, what an amazing experience that was. How many, now let's do this, we'll back into it, and I'll see how far I have to go. And I'm not even going to start beyond 2000. How many of you love music from the 90s? So we got some 90s in here. How many of you love music from the 80s? Yes, I get 2 arms up for that. 70s, 60s, 50s. All right, I won't go beyond that. Come on, we want 40s, 30s. We get back to the roaring 20s. We go back that far. Music defines so much. Music defines generations. Woodstock defined a generation. We Are the World defined a generation. Hair bands and all the excesses that were the 80s defined an entire generation. Hip-hop and pop in the 90s. And the reason I didn't do the 2000s, because I promised myself I would never become that parent who lost touch with music. And I was up too late last night, and I was watching Saturday Night Live, and it was Shia. Was that? Shia was, Shannon, who is this? Is singing. And she had read about this person that apparently is very kind of eclectic and keeps to herself. But music defines generations, and music can define people. I didn't ask who likes classical music? I enjoy classical. I played trombone in high school. There's so many genres. There's different generations and there's genres. There's, as we've already said, pop and rock and country and jazz. How could I forget jazz? I'm sorry I forgot jazz. There we go. I'm sorry I forgot jazz. Partly because I don't like jazz, but I know I forgot that. That's terrible, right? I don't know that I'm cool enough to like jazz. No, I do. I like some jazz. But music defines who we are. And we last summer we did a series on what we've learned from Hollywood. And the most popular sermon in that series was when we talked about movie music and how it kind of stirs the soul. And whether it's in movies or in life or in our car or in our showers, somehow, some way, music intersects all of our lives. When we're kind of trained that certain music elicits certain responses. If we all listened to the same music, if we were all conformed to one style, one genre, one generation, our lives and our culture would not have the depth and the breadth that it does. And I've said this, and I live by it, and I believe it more with each year that passes. As much as I love to preach and continue to hone the craft of preaching, I know that music, led by folks as gifted as the folks that we have leading our worship, music is what really sets the stage for worship. As we look in the next few weeks, as we look at the Psalms and they're being rooted in worship and song, the many hymns that are found throughout the Bible and the many hymns that stir our lives. One of my worst nightmares came true one evening in Greenville, South Carolina. My buddies and I up visiting my buddy June, who was at Furman University, and we went to a karaoke bar one night. Yeah, you see where this is going. Now, I'm not going to suggest that my friends might have had a drink or two, but they may have had a drink or two. And I was not yet 21, and even after I turned 21, didn't really drink that much. But I was a designated driver, so I was the only person in the group who was of completely sound mind, yet I was the only one who decided to get up and try to sing. And I sang a song that I thought I knew really well. And I made it my own. To the extent that folks really didn't know what it was. Now, what's interesting about karaoke is people who think about karaoke think that the very best karaoke is when someone singing karaoke can sound exactly like the original artist. And we've all been, or probably most of us have been to where we've had a karaoke machine at a party or been to a bar or a restaurant where they were having karaoke machine, and we listen, and you'll have a handful of people get up that are just a complete and total disaster. And then someone steps up to sing, and it's amazing. I think I alluded to this once before, but it's probably been over a year ago now that Jewel disguised herself and went into a karaoke bar and sang her own song. And people were sitting in the bar criticizing Jewel, who was disguised, singing her own song. She later then went out and took off the disguise and came back and sang again. Also this week, I don't know if you saw this story, Maroon 5 doing a music video went and crashed some people's weddings. Did y'all see that this week? Man, that'd be cool that you're having your wedding reception and some awesome band shows up and starts singing. But in all of these cases, what's important to remember is that we're not to be conformed. Paul is telling the church in Rome, do not be conformed to this world. And at that point, he was speaking to the church trying to be too much like the culture, too much like the government would have them to be. And he was reminding them that God was calling them to a higher calling, something more important than any one individual. But as individuals, this is what I think Paul was trying to tell us, is that we must not allow others to define who we are. We must not allow others to define who we are. Rather, we must seek to know who God needs us to be. Because the challenge is not just in defining ourselves, because each of us can define ourselves. Each of us have had dreams and aspirations. The challenge is determining which of those dreams and aspirations are in alignment for God's purpose for our life. As we find ourselves on this weekend in which we celebrate Dr. King's life and legacy, he once said that a person cannot truly know what it is they've lived for or they were created to live for until they know what they died for. A person cannot fully know what it is that they were put on earth to do, to live for, to be, until they know what they've died for. Dr. King also said, no person has the right to reign on your dreams. No person has the right to reign on your dreams. We do this with children. We try to conform them. We have these wishes, and parents too often are trying to live vicariously through their children, and they think they know what it is that God has created their children to do, and they try to push them in one direction or another. I think the worst case of this are folks who want to push kids to be preachers. It doesn't happen as much now, but there was a generation which every mother and every grandmother, and I'm going to say this, and obviously in the United Methodist Church, we fully accept men and women in ministry, but there was a time when every grandmother and every mother wanted their little boy to be a preacher. They would pray for that child to become a preacher. They would tell that child they needed to be a preacher. I think the wisdom that is cliche but true is no one should be a preacher if they think there's anything else in the world they can do. But if there's nothing else in the world that you can find that would be what God has called you to do, but yet you feel that call to ministry, then that's where you ought to be. And that's true for any vocation. It's true for any of us and what it is that we choose to do. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. It's important. Because the other side of this, we must not let others define who we are. If we're not strong, now, we don't have to know right away exactly who we are. But we have to be headed in some general direction. We have to be working on knowing that, because if we don't begin to define who we are, the world will define that for us. It's the same as the saying about priorities. If we don't set our own priorities, others will set our priorities for us. The same is true about who we are to become and who we are to be. And even when we're becoming who we're called and created to be, this is when that Lucan saying comes home so strongly. Don't ever let a song sing you. Even in your chosen profession, even with what you've been called to do. To learn to break out of the molds. To break out of what others' expectations are. Because it's the people who manage to break out of those molds, to bust out of those expectations, to not conform to what the world would be, that change the world forever. This past week was Elvis Presley's birthday. Elvis Presley came along and he sang in a way that no one had ever sung before. It's kind of funny to think about how controversial Elvis was when you look at the state of pop music today. I mean, Elvis was, that was nothing. And then Michael Jackson came along, and a little boy singing with his brothers in a relatively new record label that really changed the trajectory of things forever in the music world. It's the people who don't allow the world to hold them in a box. It's the people who are willing to take risks and look beyond the fear of failure. Because quite frankly, the easiest thing in the world to do is to take someone else's song and try to sing it just like they did. Particularly if it's a good song, and particularly if it's proven. Because although it won't be you, it'll work for a while. The difficult thing is to take that song and make it your own. And as we look toward the next couple of weeks, the even harder work is to write and sing your own song. Now let's be careful. When I say write and sing your own song, consistent with what the song that God has put upon our hearts. Because it's not all about us. You know, we talk about the me generation, and we talked about generations of musics, and really in some way, shape, or form, every decade over the last 5 or 6 decades has had some segment of that generation that was a me segment, an us segment. The good news is every generation has a segment looking beyond themselves, beyond who they are or what their needs are, to the needs of others, to the needs of the world. It occurs to me that Dr. King had a lot of pressure upon him from many different angles. His daddy was a preacher, and he was a preacher, and I'm certain there was a lot of pressure to be exactly who his daddy had been. There was a lot of pressure in this country as an African American to conform to a certain set of rules. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there was a lot of pressure to change the world in a violent way. But what Dr. King did is he refused to sing anyone else's song. What he did was to create his own song. Nonviolent social change, learning to love our neighbors, learning to serve one another, but not be willing to let the world limit any of us in any way. And so, in many ways, echoing the words of Paul and Gandhi and others before him, we must do what is good and acceptable and perfect. Later on in this 12th chapter of Romans, Paul goes on to write, "Let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, but be ardent in spirit, and serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and extend hospitality to strangers." The transformation of the world will come when we can live into these words. Not being conformed to our own subset, our own group, those people with whom we're comfortable, but being transformed in a way that we see and love each other as God sees us and as God loves us, without strings attached and without reservation. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Don't let a song sing you.